Oh,
Right.
yes, I can see you. Hello, Leslie.
Good afternoon to you. Good morning from me.
Thank you. Good morning to you. Yes, and today I was I'm very interested to make little videos for Russian auditory to about emotion focused therapy, like small talks about what is it, because despite the fact that emotion focused therapy is very well known almost all around the world, in Russian it is known very little.
Right.
So and I'm interested personally, and of course people who read the text in our project Experiential Psychotherapy Russia, they are also now interested in emotion focused therapy, like to know more. And so today I also was thinking how to start this conversation, what questions is better to ask, but maybe what comes to you, what if someone would ask what is emotion focused therapy, what would you tell him?
Well, I think there are a few things that characterize. Firstly, emotion focused therapy is a neo humanistic therapy, and we have integrated previous influences, particularly client centered, experiential, and gestalt. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but what it's ended up being is an empathically based relationship therapy, which also has process directive. So we process directive intervention. So we combine following and guiding, or following and leading, uh, and we have uh, islands of work within an ocean of empathy, right? So there are different islands of work. And these islands of work are characterized by what we call markers and tasks. So, a marker is a particular experiential state that someone enters into in a session. For example, they might state a problematic reaction, which is an idiosyncratic reaction to a specific situation. Something like, on the way to therapy, I saw a little puppy dog and I got really sad. And I don't know why I got so sad. So that's a particular state. And that differs from self criticism, which is, I'm not a good enough father, I'm not a good enough husband, I'm not a good enough friend. So these are different states, and each one of these states is an opportunity for a particular kind of intervention that fits that state.
Mm-hmm.
So for self criticism, it's good to use a two-chair dialogue, and so on. So EFT combines empathy and marker guided process directive interventions.
It's interesting because recently we with colleagues discussed what approaches can be attributed as experiential. And I know that emotion focused is also has the preface like uh, processed experiential emotion focused therapy. And we came to an agreement that emotion focused therapy can be attributed as experiential. But what do you think about it?
Yes, definitely. I mean, in 19, I can't remember actually, 1998, I think, or I edited a handbook uh, of experiential psychotherapy in which we proposed that we need to bring together what was then called process experiential, emotion focused, gestalt, client centered, experiential, existential, and possibly psychodrama, and group them under the title of experiential therapy. And it was an effort to try to integrate
Mm-hmm.
the field. It didn't work. because, you know, Gestalt therapists wanted to be Gestalt therapists and person-centered wanted to be person-centered. But, you know, I see that in order to have a more powerful or effective school or approach, it would be good for all the therapies to integrate under the notion experiential. That really didn't work.
Mm.
And then I carried on to develop an emotion-focused therapy, really as an antidote to cognitive therapy, because cognitive therapy was so dominant. And then because emotion is becoming much more scientifically respected,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like now I believe it's better to integrate things under the notion of emotion focused.
I see. Yes, and we were also discussing what is there is an idea that all approaches, all therapies relies on something. So we can say that emotion-focused therapy relies on emotions or
Yeah,
on emotions. So
absolutely, right. So you see, Zhenlin used the term, I mean, you know, developed experiential, but that's a phenomenological perspective. And he says that experience is the basic datum of human functioning. I say emotion is the basic datum of human experience, and that emotion is more fundamental than experiencing. And so that you have to, phenomenology is descriptive, not explanatory. So you have to explain, how do we derive experience? I mean, we can refer to experience, but where does it come from? And I think it requires a deeper explanation. And I think that what we come into the world with are emotions. So emotions are actually the most fundamental. And then they synthesize internally into complex internal states which generate our felt experience.
okay.
So
Yes, and what else can be important for us today to ask? Maybe if just to think what information can be used for people who want to choose emotion-focused therapy as their specialization, or if their clients, why do they would choose emotion-focused therapy as their therapy, or what will help them to make this choosing?
I'm not quite sure. You're saying, why should people choose it? Why
No,
should...
like what will attract them in your opinion?
I think that emotional avoidance or protection against emotion is a fundamental human tendency, but also a cause of a lot of disorganization or dis-ease. So that emotion-focused therapy really focuses on helping people to experience previously disclaimed emotions. And so I think the whole world, everybody has become too conceptual and intellectualized. And I think it helps people get in touch with their feeling and gives them a more vital sense of living through their bodies rather than living in their heads. And I think a lot of people have the difficulty of they have a lot of conceptual processing and narrative processes, but they're just not in touch with their emotional experience. And Janlin was against something he called sheer emotion. But we subsequently, through a lot of research, have studied both experiencing and emotional arousal. And both of them are important but different. And so EFT focuses on both your experience of the whole thing plus arousal. And I think EFT contributes by focusing on how to help people both access emotions in a very vital, visceral way, that they really feel sad, not that they talk about feeling sad. Mm-hmm. And so I think what it offers people is to get in touch with their emotions, but it makes a distinction which didn't exist earlier on between primary adaptive emotions, which are different to secondary reactive emotions, which is what I think Janlin was referring to with sheer emotion. And then that emotions can be adaptive, or they also can be maladaptive as a function of trauma. So we have a differentiated map of the emotional territory. And I think emotion is fundamentally adaptive, and we help clients to begin to deal with their fear of their painful emotions and to access their more adaptive emotions so that they can live more authentically.
Not long ago, we translated your article, Emotion-Focused Therapy, as clinical synthesis. And there were description of markers that you use in your work. And it was mentioned that there is special markers for trauma. Can you speak a little about what is your understanding in emotion-focused therapy of trauma, and what markers of trauma can...
Right. So, I mean, generally we approach trauma as unfinished business, and usually it's with people. I mean, there can be trauma, due to accident and things like that, and generally we focused on complex trauma, which means abuse in the family, abuse or trauma within relationships, not say combat trauma. And then we're dealing with a whole set of feelings within the complex relationship. And we do use empty chair dialogue, where you might dialogue with the actual abuser or the perpetrator. And what one of my former students and colleagues found in a big study with women who were raped and abused is that 66% of the women were able to put the abuser in the empty chair. 1/3 were not. It was too overwhelming. It was too dysregulating. Then we would work with those people without the direct dialogue in an empty chair. But there is some evidence that if people can get engaged in the dialogue in an empty chair, they do better at the end of treatment, because they really are activated and reprocessing the traumatic experience and the traumatic feelings. So it's quite confrontational, not that we are confronting the client, but the client is confronting the abuser. And generally then they have to work through their painful feelings, which they've been disclaiming or disavowing and trying not to feel. And we are trying to help them evoke those feelings and reprocess them. And reprocessing really means bringing language or cognition to bear on emotion, to begin to make it more organized and more coherent. So the key issue in emotion-focused therapy in general is activating emotion, but then reflecting on it to make sense of it. It's activating it and experiencing it and making sense of it. So it's not a cathartic model where you're getting rid of emotion. So we would work with trauma with reactivation of some of the emotion schematic memories, and then trying to bring new emotions. So essentially, when you feel a lot of shame and fear, we're going to try to activate those, process those, then bring in new emotions like empowered anger and the sadness of grief. And there's this research on reconsolidation memory, which is showing that if you activate an emotion, it becomes open or labile. And if you bring in new experience within a period of time after activating the emotion, it's likely that the new experience will be incorporated into the memory. So you can actually change memory, but you have to activate the memory to change it.
Yes, this is very interesting and really something new. And I know that we are limited, but by time, maybe the last question, how do you use emotion-focused therapy in your everyday life? Do you have your own tips for living using it?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last word. Do I have my own?
Your own tips of using emotion-focused therapy in your life, in your everyday life?
Well, I think, I mean, I've just come from Brazil, and the person there told me what he was most amazed at is how aware I am of my own emotions. So I think, you know, I'm paying a lot of attention to my own emotion all the time. And so that's emotion awareness. And also, I think at this age of my life, when I'm in relationship, I'm able somewhat to communicate from my very basic felt experience and to say to a partner, I'm holding my breath, I just felt a sinking in my stomach, rather than blame or, you know, I mean, I'm not always able to do that, but I'm sort of more aware of what's going on in my body in relation to my feelings. So that's how I think I apply it. And I'm aware of secondary reactive emotions and searching for my more primary underlying vulnerable feeling.
So it's like you're more connected to yourself, to what's going on.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Yes, this is so interesting and great. Thank you so much. And do you have something like what you would like to say today at the end?
Well, my hope is for there to be a revival of experiential therapies and emotion-focused therapy. And I think there is a sea change going on, that finally cognitive therapy has sort of reached its peak, and that they're recognizing emotion as a scientifically valid phenomena. And so slowly things are changing, but it's going to take a long time because there's a lot of social, economic, politics involved in psychotherapy and psychotherapy research.